My family scientifically designed me to save my brother, but when I refused to give him my kidney at 24, I exposed the truth. And my mother was broken when she found out I recorded everything. I'm 24 years old. I work in freelance graphic design, and honestly, I need to get this story off my chest because I've been processing what I discovered about my life, about why I exist, for months now. And there are still days when I wake up thinking it was all a nightmare. But it wasn't. The thing is, my parents literally had me to save my older brother. And when I say literally, I'm not exaggerating or being dramatic. I mean, they conceived me specifically, scientifically, to be his donor. And when I refused to give him a kidney about 8 months ago, my entire life fell apart in a way I never imagined possible. I guess I should start at the beginning, or at least what I thought was the beginning. I grew up in a normal suburb outside of Denver. You know, 2-story house, yard with those bushes that nobody really takes care of but don't die either, that kind of place. My brother Dominic is 4 years older than me, so he's 28 now, and he was always the center of attention at home. When I was a kid, I noticed it but didn't think much of it. Like, I thought it was normal because he was the oldest, you know what I mean? My parents were always more focused on him, on his grades, on his soccer games, on whatever. I existed kind of in the background, and looking back, I should have seen it coming. All those signs were there, but I was just a kid trying to get my parents to see me. I remember when I was like 7 or 8 years old, Dominic got sick with something. They never told me exactly what, but he was in the hospital for several weeks. My parents basically lived there with him. And I stayed with my Aunt Sharon, my dad's sister. At that time, they took me to get some blood tests done. They told me it was to make sure I was healthy too. And being a kid, I didn't question anything. Years later, I would understand that was the moment they used me as a bone marrow donor for Dominic. But back then, I only remember my arm hurting from the needle sticks and that I missed my parents. Dominic recovered. Everything went back to normal. Well, what I considered normal, which was basically everything revolving around him. Fast forward to like 9 months ago. I had just moved into my own apartment, one of those small studios, but it was mine. You know, the first place where I felt like I could breathe without someone telling me what to do. I was dating Michael, my now fiancé, and things were going well. I mean, my life was finally starting to feel like my own. And then my mom called me on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember it perfectly because I was working on a project for a client, and her tone of voice let me know immediately that something was wrong. She told me I needed to come home that same day, that Dominic was sick again, and that it was serious. I went to the house that night and the atmosphere was so heavy, my parents were on the couch with those faces they have when something really serious is happening. My dad, who's normally the calm one in the family, looked devastated. I sat down and they told me that Dominic had chronic kidney disease, that his kidneys were failing and he needed a transplant. I felt my stomach drop. I'm not going to lie, because as much as my brother and I were never super close, I didn't want him to die either. You know what I mean? But then came the part that left me frozen. My mom, without even asking me, without even posing it as a possibility, simply said, "You're going to donate a kidney to your brother." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Like she was saying, "You're going to have dinner with us on Sunday, or you're going to wear that blue sweater." I just sat there trying to process what I had just heard, and all I could say was, "Wait, what?" And my dad jumped into the conversation saying they had already talked to the doctors, that I was the best option because we were genetically compatible, obviously, and that they needed me to go get some tests done as soon as possible to confirm I could donate. I was still in shock. Like, they had literally just informed me that I was expected to give them an organ for my brother as if they were asking to borrow the car. I told them I needed to think about it, that it was an important decision and that I wanted to talk to doctors on my own, understand the risks. My mom looked at me like I had just spit in her face. She told me there was nothing to think about, that Dominic needed me and I was his sister. Dominic was sitting there in silence, looking at me with those victim eyes he always put on when he wanted something, and I felt the pressure crushing me. I told them I was going to research it and that I would give them an answer soon. I left that house feeling like I couldn't breathe properly, like the air was too thick. I spent the next 2 weeks researching everything I could about living kidney donation. I talked to doctors, read studies, joined online support groups for donors, and what I discovered scared me so much. The thing is, donating a kidney isn't like donating blood. I mean, it's major surgery with serious risks. I could have complications. I could develop kidney problems myself in the future. I could have chronic hypertension. And worst of all, from a practical standpoint, my health insurance probably wouldn't cover long-term complications related to the donation. I was looking at the possibility of being in debt for life if something went wrong, and working freelance without robust corporate insurance. That was a very real possibility. Plus, and I know this sounds selfish, but I don't care, I had plans for my life. Michael and I had started talking about marriage, about having kids eventually, and all the doctors told me that although I could have a healthy pregnancy with only one kidney, the risk of complications increased significantly. I was 24 years old, my whole life ahead of me, and I was being asked to put it at risk without even the courtesy of really being asked if I wanted to do it. I went back to my parents' house like 3 weeks after that first conversation. I was nervous. My hands were sweating, and I had mentally rehearsed what I was going to say like 1,000 times. I sat in front of them and Dominic in the same living room, and I told them I couldn't donate the kidney. I explained the risks, the financial implications, my life plans, everything. I talked for like 10 minutes, laying out my reasons in the calmest and most logical way possible. And when I finished, the silence that followed was terrifying. My mom exploded. She started yelling at me that I was selfish. How could I think about money and hypothetical risks when my brother was literally dying? My dad was sitting there shaking his head with that expression of disappointment that hurts more than anger. Dominic started crying, like dramatic tears, saying he couldn't believe his own sister was going to let him die. And the guilt I felt in that moment was physically painful, like they were squeezing my chest with a vice. But I stood firm. I told them my decision was made, and I hoped they would understand. My mom then said something that in that moment I didn't fully process, but that would haunt me later. She said, with that trembling voice full of tears, "You were born to help him, Natalie. That's your purpose." I thought she was being dramatic, using some weird metaphor about family and duty or something. I left there feeling horrible, but also sure that I had made the right decision for me. I didn't talk to my parents for like a week. They sent me messages every day calling me selfish, saying Dominic was getting worse, basically trying to guilt-trip me into changing my mind. Then my Aunt Sharon called me. She and I had always had a good relationship. She was like the cool aunt who would listen to you without judging. She asked if we could meet for coffee, and I agreed because I needed to talk to someone who wouldn't make me feel like a horrible person. We met at a coffee shop near my apartment, and when I arrived, she looked weird, like nervous and sad at the same time. We ordered our coffees and sat at a table in the back, and then she told me something that literally changed everything. She told me, "Natalie, I need to tell you something about your birth, about why you exist." And I laughed because I thought she was being dramatic, but her face was completely serious. She told me that when Dominic was 4 years old, he got seriously ill. He had a blood disease that required a bone marrow transplant. My parents weren't compatible, no relatives were compatible, and they were desperate. So they found a doctor, a fertility specialist who did a procedure that at the time was like experimental, where basically they could conceive a baby that would be genetically compatible with Dominic to be his donor. I sat there staring at my aunt like she was speaking another language. I told her that couldn't be true, that it sounded like science fiction or something. But she kept talking. She told me my parents had gone through in vitro fertilization, that they had created multiple embryos, tested them genetically, and selected the one that was a perfect match for Dominic. That embryo was me. I was conceived, literally designed, to save my brother. And then came the part that completely destroyed me. My aunt told me, with tears in her eyes, that before I was born, my parents had gotten pregnant naturally 3 times after Dominic's diagnosis. And they had terminated those 3 pregnancies because the babies weren't genetically compatible with him. 3 potential brothers or sisters who never got to be born because they couldn't save Dominic. And then they finally had me. And when I was 8 years old and Dominic got sick again, they used my bone marrow to save him. Those blood tests, I remembered. That time I spent with my aunt while Dominic was in the hospital. It all made sense now in the most horrible way possible. I don't remember much of the rest of that conversation with my aunt. I think I cried. I think maybe I screamed. I don't know. The next thing I clearly remember is being on my apartment floor, with Michael hugging me while I had what was probably a panic attack. My entire sense of identity, of who I was, crumbled in that moment. I wasn't Natalie, the daughter, the sister, the person. I was Natalie, Dominic's spare part, the solution designed in a lab to keep him alive. The following days were blurry. I didn't leave my apartment, barely ate. Michael practically moved in with me to make sure I was okay. My aunt had given me documents, medical records she had secretly kept for years because she knew that someday I would need to know the truth. She had the bills from the fertility treatment, the genetic analysis of the embryos, everything. It was real. It was all completely real. And I didn't know how to process that. I confronted my parents like a week later. I went to their house unannounced, walked in with the documents in hand and threw them on the kitchen table in front of them. I asked them if it was true, if they really had conceived me just to save Dominic. My mom went pale. My dad couldn't look me in the eye. The silence that followed was all the confirmation I needed. Then my mom tried to justify herself, saying they had done it because they loved Dominic, because they couldn't let him die, that I was a miracle that had saved my brother. I yelled at her, and I had never yelled at my mother in my life. I yelled at her that I wasn't a miracle. I was a product, a tool they had designed for a specific purpose. I asked her if they had ever loved me for myself or if I was always just Dominic's life insurance. My dad finally spoke, tried to tell me they loved me, that I was their daughter and they loved me, but his words sounded empty. Dominic was there too, and he had the audacity to look offended, like I was the bad guy in the story for being angry about having been literally created to serve him. I told them I never wanted to see them again, that they were dead to me. I know it sounds dramatic, but in that moment I felt it completely. I left that house and blocked their numbers, their emails, everything, but they weren't going to give up that easily. Like 2 weeks later, I was driving back to my apartment after meeting with a client when I saw police lights behind me. They pulled me over, and the officer told me they had received an anonymous tip that my car might be transporting drugs. My heart was beating like crazy. I've never touched drugs in my life. I don't even smoke weed. They searched my car and found a bag with pills in the glove compartment. I was in complete shock, swearing those weren't mine, that someone had put them there. They handcuffed me, were going to arrest me, and I was completely hysterical. But then, and this was like a miracle, the officer checked the security cameras from the parking lot where my car had been that morning. It turns out the building where I had the meeting with the client had cameras covering the parking area. The footage clearly showed Dominic approaching my car, looking around to make sure nobody saw him, and putting something in the glove compartment. They had it on video. My own brother had tried to get me arrested, probably thinking that if I was in enough trouble, I'd be desperate and finally agree to give him the kidney or something. I don't know. His logic was always twisted. They arrested Dominic that same night. I pressed charges without hesitating for even a second, because what kind of person does that? What kind of brother tries to completely ruin his sister's life that way? My parents went to the police station and, you know what they did? They blamed me. They said I had provoked Dominic by refusing to help him, that he was desperate and had acted out of desperation. My mom literally said it was all my fault for being so selfish in the first place. Dominic went to trial and was convicted. Not to prison. As for very long. Like I think 18 months. But it was enough. Meanwhile, my parents started a complete campaign against me. They created a GoFundMe account for Dominic's medical expenses, and in the description, they basically painted a story where I was the evil sister who refused to save her dying brother. They didn't mention anything about the fact that I had been conceived specifically as a donor, nothing about the 3 terminated pregnancies, nothing about the real truth, just that their son was dying and their cruel daughter refused to help. The story went viral in our community. I started receiving hate messages from strangers. People recognized me on the street and yelled horrible things at me. I lost clients because they didn't want to work with the girl who was letting her brother die. It was an absolute nightmare. Michael supported me through everything. He was incredible. But there were days when I just wanted to disappear. Then Dr. Campbell came into the picture. He was now my parents' family doctor from before I was born. He was retired by that point but had followed the story in the local news. He contacted me through my Aunt Sharon and offered me something that changed everything. Complete medical documentation of my conception and birth. Turns out he had never agreed with what my parents had done, thought it was ethically questionable, and had kept detailed records of everything, including notes about the 3 terminated pregnancies. With those documents, I was able to tell my real side of the story. I shared them publicly, with journalists, with anyone who wanted to listen. The narrative completely changed. Suddenly, I wasn't the villain. My parents were. People started to understand that I wasn't simply a sister refusing to help. I was a human being who had been created as a human spare part and was exercising my right to bodily autonomy. The doctor who had performed the fertilization and genetic selection, who by that point was also retired, was investigated. Turns out what he had done at that time was ethically questionable, but technically legal, because laws about genetic baby design were practically non-existent at the time. But he lost his medical license anyway for other ethical violations they discovered during the investigation. And apparently we weren't the only family. There were other similar cases that came to light. The whole thing became a huge scandal. My parents couldn't handle the narrative shift. The people who had supported them before turned their backs on them. Relatives who had been on their side started questioning them. The GoFundMe was reported and eventually shut down. They became social pariahs. And honestly, I didn't feel a single ounce of compassion for them. But then they tried something absolutely despicable. Like 6 months after all this, they posted on social media that Dominic had attempted suicide, that he was in the hospital in critical condition, and that it was my fault for abandoning him. In his time of need, they posted pictures of what was supposedly Dominic in a hospital bed with tubes and everything. The post went viral immediately, and I started receiving another wave of hate. But I had already learned not to trust anything they said. I called the hospital where Dominic was supposedly admitted, and there was no record of him being admitted. I called the prison where he was serving his sentence, and they confirmed he was perfectly fine, serving his time without problems. The photos they had posted were fake, probably from the internet or staged. They had invented a complete suicide attempt to try to manipulate me and get me to come back. I reported the post to authorities for making a false report and for harassment. My parents were investigated again, and at this point, nobody believed them about anything. The few relatives who still talked to them finally cut contact. Even some neighbors started avoiding them. They had dug their own social grave, and all because they couldn't accept that I was a person with my own rights, not just an organ bank for Dominic. About 4 months ago, I decided to move completely out of Colorado. I needed to start fresh in a place where nobody knew my story, where I could just be Natalie, not the girl from the designer baby scandal. Michael came with me. He got a job in Seattle, and I continued with my freelance work that I can do from anywhere. We got engaged last month, and we're planning a small wedding, just with people who really matter to us and who have supported us through all of this. And here comes the part that makes me feel complicated things. I'm pregnant, like 3 months. When I took the test and it came back positive, I had a moment of total panic, because the first thing I thought about was my parents and how they had brought me into the world. I was afraid that somehow I was perpetuating something, that my baby would feel what I felt. But then Michael hugged me and reminded me that this baby is being conceived with love, without conditions, without hidden purposes. This baby is going to be loved for who they are, not for what they can do or give. I've been in therapy since all this exploded. Obviously, because how do you process something like this without professional help? And my therapist says I'm making incredible progress, that I've broken the cycle of toxicity in my family, and that I'm building something new and healthy. Some days I believe her. Other days I still wake up with that feeling in my chest of not being good enough, of existing only to serve others. But I'm working on it. I haven't talked to my parents in almost a year. I don't know how Dominic is now, if he got a kidney from someone else or if he's still on dialysis. Part of me, a very small part that I hate to admit exists, still worries about him, but most of me doesn't feel anything anymore, not even hate, just an emptiness where the concept of family used to be. My Aunt Sharon is still part of my life. She comes to visit us in Seattle when she can, and she's going to be my baby's honorary grandmother. Some cousins also keep in touch, the people who understood my side of the story and who didn't judge me for exercising my right to say no. That's my family now, the people I chose, not the ones who chose me for my genetic code. Last week, I had my first ultrasound and saw my baby's heartbeat. Michael was crying with happiness, and so was I. But my tears were complicated. You know? Happy because this baby is wanted and loved, but also sad because I never had that. My parents never looked at me in an ultrasound with pure and simple love. There was always an asterisk. I was always Natalie. Who can save Dominic? Never just Natalie. But this baby, my baby, is going to know from day one that they are loved unconditionally. They're going to know that their value isn't in what they can give or do for others, but simply in existing. I'm going to break that cycle even if it kills me trying. I'm going to be the mother I needed and never had. There are still difficult days. 2 days when I wonder what would have happened if I had donated the kidney, if maybe I would have kept some kind of relationship with my biological family. But then I remember that a family that only values you for your organs isn't really a family. I remember that saying no was saving myself, and that doesn't make me selfish. It makes me human. I don't know if I'll ever completely forgive my parents. Therapy tells me that forgiveness is for me, not for them. But honestly, I'm not there yet, and I don't know if I ever will be. What I do know is that I deserve more than what they gave me. I deserve to be loved for who I am, not for what I can provide. And my baby is going to grow up knowing that from day one. Sometimes I think about the 3 brothers or sisters who were never born. The pregnancies my parents terminated because those babies couldn't save Dominic. I wonder who they would have been, what lives they would have had. It's weird to feel grief for people who never existed, but I do. We were all expendable at the altar of keeping Dominic alive, and that's something I have to live with. But I'm building a new life. A life where love doesn't come with impossible conditions, where my value isn't determined by my genetic compatibility. Seattle is beautiful. Our apartment has a view of the mountains. Michael is my partner in everything. And in a few months, I'm going to hold my baby in my arms and promise them that they will never, ever have to earn my love. They already have it, complete and unconditional, just for existing. That's enough for me now. It has to be.